The knock came on a Tuesday in late May, soft as a sparrow's wing against the weathered pine of Myrtle Doyle's front door, and she nearly did not answer it. She had not answered much of anything all spring, not the calls of her neighbor Mrs. Hartwell 2 properties over, who had twice sent her eldest boy with a covered dish of salt pork and cornbread. Not the gentle inquiries of Reverend Plunkett, who had left a note folded on her porch rail in April suggesting that the Lord's house might offer some comfort. Not even the monthly visit of the mail rider, Amos, who had taken to leaving her correspondence tucked between the door and the frame, rather than knock a third time after she had refused to answer the first 2. She had kept to herself all spring, and she had built a careful, brittle life out of that keeping. Every morning she rose before dawn, lit the stove with hands that had learned not to tremble anymore, fed the 2 chickens that remained of the original 8 she had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas with back in March of 1882, and she sat with her coffee and watched the sun bleed up over the flat prairie horizon. She did not cry anymore. Crying required hope that something might change, and she had surrendered that particular luxury somewhere around the 3rd week of April. So when the knock came, small and uncertain, she sat very still at her kitchen table and waited for it to stop. It did not stop. It came again, 3 precise raps, and then a voice so young it made her chest cave in. "Ma'am, are you in there, ma'am?" She was on her feet before she decided to stand. Something about the smallness of that voice cut straight through every wall she had built. She crossed the 12 feet of her main room, her boots loud on the plank floor, and pulled the door open with more force than she intended. Standing on her porch was a child, a boy, no older than 6, with dark hair that grew in every direction at once and eyes so brown they were nearly black, wide and earnest and fixed on her face with an intensity that was unsettling in someone so small. He wore a cotton shirt that was too large for him, tucked haphazardly into trousers that were too short, and he held his hat in both hands, turning it in circles with his fingers the way men did when they were nervous. She recognized something in that gesture, the language of a person trying very hard to be brave. "Ma'am," he said again, and his voice was steadier now that the door was open. "My name is Ezra Wallace. My pa farms the land east of yours, the one with the red barn that needs painting." She knew the farm. She had seen the man from a distance, always at work, always moving, a tall figure against the wide sky. She had not introduced herself to him either. She had not introduced herself to anyone. "I know the farm," she said carefully. Her own voice surprised her. She had not used it much in weeks, and it came out rougher than she intended, like a hinge that needed oil. Ezra Wallace turned his hat another full revolution. Then he looked up at her with those grave, enormous eyes, and asked the question that would break open the rest of the year like a stone thrown through glass. "Are you lonely too?" The words hit her square in the chest. Not because they were accusatory, not because they were rude, but because they were asked with such simple, undefended honesty that she had no armor for them. The boy was not asking to be cruel. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know, and because the answer mattered to him, and because it was entirely clear from the way he held his hat and the way his lower lip was slightly unsteady that he himself was very, very lonely. Her throat closed. She had not cried since April. She had been so proud of that. She stepped back from the door and said, "Come in then, I'll put on fresh coffee." That was how it started. That was the crack in the dam. And the flood that followed would change everything she thought she knew about survival, about grief, about dark pasts that chase you across a continent, and about the terrifying, impossible, forbidden-feeling notion that a person can begin again. To understand what that knock meant, you have to understand where Myrtle Doyle had come from, and what she had left behind, and why she had chosen Caldwell, Kansas of all the places in the known world. She had been born Myrtle Ann Reeves in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the year 1858. Her father had been a pharmacist of modest success and great integrity, a man who kept meticulous records and never added water to his tinctures, and she had grown up in a household that valued precision and honesty, the way other households valued silver or land. She had been educated past what was typical for women of her station, because her father believed an educated mind was the only inheritance that could not be stolen, and she could do mathematics in her head faster than most men could do them on paper. She had met Gerald Doyle when she was 22, at a lecture on agricultural chemistry at the Cincinnati Mechanics Institute, which she had attended because she found chemistry genuinely interesting, and he had attended because a woman he was pursuing had mentioned she might go. The other woman had not gone. Myrtle had, and Gerald had sat next to her and been entirely disarmed by the fact that she could follow the lecture better than he could. Gerald had been handsome in a straightforward way, dark-haired, broad-shouldered, with a laugh that came easily and a talent for making people feel that the room had brightened when he entered it. They had courted for 8 months, married in the spring of 1881, and had been genuinely, ordinarily happy for a period of approximately 14 months. Then Gerald had made a choice that was either very brave or very foolish, and the two of them had never quite agreed on which. And then he had died of a fever in the fall of 1881 somewhere in eastern Colorado while trying to scout land for a homestead claim, and Myrtle had been left at 23 years old with the wreckage of a plan that no longer had its architect. She could have gone back to Cincinnati. Her father would have taken her in without a word of reproach. But something stubborn and possibly irrational had taken root in her, some insistence that Gerald's dream deserved to not simply evaporate the way Gerald himself had evaporated. And so she had filed for the land herself under the Homestead Act of 1862, which allowed widowed women to do exactly that. And she had taken herself and 2 trunks and 8 chickens to Caldwell, Kansas, which was not the Colorado dream Gerald had described, but was close enough to the direction he had pointed that she could tell herself she was honoring something. She had arrived in March of 1882, when the prairie was still brown and the wind had ice in it. She had moved into the small frame house on the claim that had been partially built by its previous settler, a man named Granger who had given up after one winter and gone back east. She had unpacked her 2 trunks and her mother's quilt and her father's chemistry books, which she had no practical use for out here but could not bear to leave behind, and she had set about trying to survive. And she had done it. Through the spring planting season, which she had approached with the same methodical precision her father had applied to his pharmacy records, through the brutal, airless Kansas summer, through an autumn that was kind, through a winter that was not. By the following spring, the spring of 1883, she had lost 6 of her 8 chickens to a fox that had found a gap in the coop she had not properly identified. She had lost, earlier than that, the last remaining warmth she had carried inside herself, the last echoing sense that Gerald was somewhere nearby in spirit and that she was doing something right. She was surviving. But surviving, she had discovered, is not the same as living, and it is exhausting in a way that dying might not be, because it requires the same effort every single day with no guarantee that the effort will ever be rewarded with anything more than another day that also requires the effort. So she had kept to herself all spring, had kept her grief and her loneliness and her dark past, which was not dramatically dark in the way of dime novels but was dark the way an unlit room is dark, simply an absence of what should be there, hidden behind a closed door and a pattern of not answering. Until Ezra Wallace sat down at her kitchen table, accepted a cup of coffee that she diluted significantly with water because she did not actually know what was appropriate to give a 6-year-old, and told her with great seriousness that his pa was lonely too. "He doesn't say so," Ezra said carefully, both hands wrapped around the tin cup she had given him. "But I can tell. He gets this look when he thinks nobody's watching, like he forgot something important and can't remember what." Myrtle sat across from him and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the sharp, particular pain of recognizing yourself in someone else's words. "How old are you, Ezra?" she asked. "6," he said. "I'll be 7 in September. My sister Clara is 9. She told me not to bother you because you clearly want to be left alone. But I thought maybe you wanted to be left alone the way I want to be left alone sometimes, when actually what I want is for someone to come find me anyway." She stared at him. This child, who was 6 years old and turning his hat in circles, had just articulated the central contradiction of loneliness better than any philosopher she had ever read. "That is very wise," she said quietly. He nodded, apparently unsurprised by the compliment. "My pa says I think too much." "Your pa," she said before she could stop herself, "sounds like someone worth meeting." Ezra looked up at her, and something in his expression shifted, some careful hope rearranging itself in his young face. He smiled, and it was such an unguarded, wholehearted smile that it did something to her chest she had not expected. "I could bring him over," he said. "If you wanted." She should have said no. She had a carefully constructed life of not wanting things. Wanting things created obligations, and obligations created the possibility of loss, and she had had quite enough loss. "Tell him," she said instead, "that his neighbor would like to introduce herself properly, if he's of a mind to visit." Ezra drained the rest of his diluted coffee, set the cup down with great precision, retrieved his hat from the table, and stood up with the bearing of a person who has just completed a very important mission. "I'll tell him," he said. "He'll come. He's polite." She watched him cross her porch and step down into the yard and set off at a trot across the flat land toward the east, his hat now firmly on his head at a slight angle, and she stood in her doorway and watched him until he was a small moving point against the enormous sky. Then she turned back into her house and looked at the 2 tin cups on the table. She washed them both. Then she combed her hair, which she had not done with any particular care since April, and she told herself this was not significant. It was, of course, entirely significant. Tobias Wallace came the following afternoon, which in retrospect told her something about him, because a man with nothing to prove would have taken several days to respond, and a man with something to gain would have come that same evening. He came the next afternoon, which suggested he was simply a man who took a reasonable request seriously and did not believe in unnecessary delay. She heard his horse before she saw him, a steady, unhurried pace that matched what she had imagined of him. She had been in the garden, or what would eventually be a garden if the seeds she had planted 2 weeks ago decided to take, and she was on her knees in the dirt when she heard him, and she stood and dusted her hands against her skirt and thought that this was not the impression she had intended to make. He came around the corner of the fence line and dismounted before she had time to fully compose herself, and she got her first real look at Tobias Wallace and found that he was not what she had constructed in her imagination. She had pictured someone with the same angular, work-sharpened handsomeness as Gerald, but Tobias Wallace was broader, quieter looking. He stood about 6 feet, with the kind of build that suggested he had been doing hard physical work for a long time without making a performance of it. His hair was brown, going toward dark, and it was cut practically rather than stylishly. His face was weathered in the way that all faces were weathered out here. The sun did not make exceptions, but there were lines around his eyes that came from squinting into the distance rather than from age, and he had a jaw that was clean-shaven except for a shadow that suggested he had shaved this morning specifically for this visit. She noticed that. She noticed it and tucked it away. He took his hat off when he saw her, which struck her as a courtesy that was slightly old-fashioned and entirely genuine. "Mrs. Doyle," he said. His voice was lower than she had expected, and even and careful, like a man who chose his words the way you choose where to step in uncertain terrain. "I'm Tobias Wallace. My boy tells me I owe you a proper introduction." "Your boy is right," she said, and she walked toward him and held out her hand, because she had decided somewhere between yesterday afternoon and this morning that she was tired of small hesitations and she was going to be direct. "Myrtle Doyle. I've been your neighbor for 14 months and I apologize for the delay. He shook her hand firmly, not gingerly the way some men shook a woman's hand as if it might break, but squarely, the way he would have shaken another man's hand, and she appreciated that. No apology needed, he said. You've had a hard winter by the look of your fences. She almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of all the things he might have said. He had named the fences, practical, concrete, not a single note of pity. I've had a hard everything, she said. But yes, the fences in particular. He looked at the fence line with the particular assessing gaze of a man who has fixed a great many fences. I could take a look at them, he said, if you'd like another pair of eyes. I'd like that very much, she said, and was surprised by how true it was. They walked the fence line together that first afternoon, and she learned several things about Tobias Wallace. He was not a man who filled silence with words. He used words the way he used tools, specifically when they were the right instrument for the job, and he put them down when the job was done. He had come to Kansas from Tennessee 5 years ago, in 1878. He did not say why he had left Tennessee, and she did not ask, because she recognized the shape of a secret that a person is not ready to share, and she had several of her own. He had 2 children, Ezra, whom she had met, and Clara, who was 9 and apparently extremely skeptical of this visit. He mentioned Clara twice, both times with a tone that contained equal parts exasperation and bottomless love. His wife had died. He said this once plainly, not as an invitation for condolence or a bid for sympathy, but simply as a fact that was relevant to the current geography of his life. Her name had been Dorothy. She had died of typhoid in 1880. He had been farming alone, raising 2 children alone for 3 years. Myrtle did not offer condolences. She said, I understand the arithmetic of loss, and he looked at her sideways with an expression she could not quite read, and then he nodded once, and that was all that needed to be said about it. He found 3 places in her fence where the posts had rotted at the base and needed replacing. He told her which posts and why, and what wood she should use, and where she could get it from the mill in town. He did not offer to fix it for her, which she thought some men might have done, presenting themselves as necessary. He just gave her the information, as if it were obvious that she was capable of acting on it herself. She decided she liked him very much. He stayed for coffee before he left, and she made a proper pot this time, and they sat on her porch in the long afternoon light, and she told him about Cincinnati, and he told her about Tennessee in sparse, careful sentences, and they talked about farming, which was the shared language of everyone out here, the one subject that carried no risk because it demanded only observation and fact. When he left, he said, My children will be wanting supper, but I thank you for the coffee, Mrs. Doyle. Myrtle, she said, because she was tired of Mrs. Doyle, which sounded like a life she was still trying to figure out how to inhabit. He paused with one foot in the stirrup. Tobias, he said, and he said it as if offering something. She accepted it. Good evening, Tobias. He rode east toward the red barn that needed painting, and she watched him go, and she noticed that the long, flat emptiness of the prairie looked slightly different than it had that morning. The visits became regular after that, not deliberately arranged, or not at first, but following the natural logic of proximity and need. He came by on a Thursday to help replace 2 of the 3 rotted fence posts, because he happened to have the right timber, and it would have been wasteful to haul it into town. She brought over a pot of stew on a Friday because she had made too much, and it kept poorly in the warm weather. He stopped by on a Sunday afternoon with Ezra, who had appointed himself her friend with the wholehearted decisiveness that only 6-year-olds possess. Clara came reluctantly the 3rd Sunday. She was a precise, serious child with her father's thoughtful eyes, and a quantity of dark hair that she wore in a braid so tight it looked like it was keeping something contained. She shook Myrtle's hand with a formality that was both charming and heartbreaking, the way children are heartbreaking when they have learned to protect themselves before they were old enough to understand why protection is necessary. Ezra says you're nice, Clara said, in a tone that made clear she was reserving judgment. Ezra is generous, Myrtle said. I hope to earn your opinion independently. Clara looked at her. Then she said, "We'll see," and went to look at the chickens. Tobias, standing beside Myrtle on the porch, exhaled slowly. "She's cautious," he said, not apologetically but with the kind of exhausted understanding of a parent who has watched their child build walls and knows exactly where the walls came from. "She's smart," Myrtle said. "Cautious and smart are not the same thing, but in her case they appear to be companions." He looked at her. That sidelong look again, the one she was beginning to catalog the way a naturalist catalogs bird calls, trying to understand its language. "She's been looking after her brother since she was 6, he said quietly. "She takes it seriously." "I can tell," Myrtle said. She was quiet for a moment, watching Clara crouch down to peer at the 2 remaining chickens through the slats of the coop with an expression of concentrated scientific interest. "She doesn't need to look after me. I want her to know that." "She'll figure that out," Tobias said. "She's smart." He said it the way she had said it, with the same quiet note of pride, and she recognized in that moment that he was a man who paid attention, who noticed when people said things worth noticing. She was in very serious trouble, she thought, and she thought it with something that felt uncomfortably like joy. The dark past she had carried all spring began to reveal itself in fragments, the way geological strata appear when water cuts through stone, in layers, each one requiring the exposure of the one above it before it can be seen. The first layer was simple grief. Gerald, the fever in Colorado, the telegram that had reached her in Cincinnati in October of 1881, terse and devastating, the language of official communication that treats death as an administrative matter. She told Tobias about this one evening in early June, sitting on her porch as the sun collapsed behind the flat horizon and the sky went through its nightly transformation, that extravagant prairie sunset that was the one thing this landscape offered without qualification. He listened without interrupting. When she was done he said, "He sounds like someone who followed what he believed in." "He did," she said. "I'm still deciding whether that's admirable or infuriating." "Probably both," Tobias said. "Probably both," she agreed. The second layer was harder. There was a reason she had chosen Caldwell, Kansas specifically, and it was not only because it was vaguely in the direction Gerald had pointed. Caldwell in 1883 was a cattle town at the end of the Kishom Trail, loud and occasionally lawless in the summer months when the drives came through, and she had chosen it in part because she had calculated correctly that a woman keeping quietly to herself would not be remarkable in a place where remarkable things happened constantly, and a quiet woman was practically invisible. She had needed to be invisible, not from Gerald's death, which was a private tragedy rather than a public one. From something else. From a man named Hale Prescott, who was Gerald's business partner in the land speculation venture that had sent Gerald west, and who had, upon Gerald's death, decided that the investment Gerald had made in the venture using joint funds was now Prescott's by default, and that the legal argument for this position was clear enough that he had been willing to pursue it through Cincinnati's courts. He had lost that particular case. Myrtle's father, who combined great integrity with great stubbornness in proportions that were occasionally overwhelming, had engaged a lawyer on his daughter's behalf, and the court had sided with Myrtle. The money, what remained of it after Gerald's venture expenses, had been returned to her. It was not a large sum. It was enough, combined with the homestead claim, to give her a start. But Hale Prescott had not taken kindly to losing in court. He was the kind of man, she had come to understand, for whom any defeat was an injury that required a response. He had friends in Cincinnati who were willing to make things uncomfortable for her. Social things, the kind of pressure that a widow living with her father in a society-conscious city feels at every dinner table and church pew, subtle exclusion, whispered questions about her character, suggestions that perhaps the money had not been acquired entirely honestly. She had left. It was not precisely running away. It was a strategic withdrawal in the face of a sustained campaign designed to make her position untenable, and she felt the distinction was important. She told Tobias this in pieces, across several conversations through June, and she watched his face carefully as she did, looking for the particular expression she had learned to dread, the expression that rearranged sympathy into calculation, that took information and held it for later use. She did not see that expression. What she saw instead, when she looked at Tobias Wallace's face as she described Hale Prescott and the court case and the social campaign that had followed, was anger. Quiet, controlled anger, the kind that sits behind the eyes rather than erupting from the mouth. "He sounds like a coward," Tobias said, when she had finished describing the manner in which one of Prescott's friends had publicly questioned, at a dinner party she had been unable to avoid, whether a widow so recently bereaved ought to be managing financial matters at all. "He's not a coward," she said carefully. "He's worse than a coward. He's a man who is intelligent and skilled and who uses those qualities to take from people who have less leverage than he does. Cowards just run away. Prescott advances." Tobias was quiet for a moment. "Does he know where you are?" The question landed with a precise weight. She had been waiting for someone to ask it for months. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I was not careful enough about my trail. I thought the distance would be sufficient. Kansas is not Cincinnati, but he has resources and he is persistent and he is the kind of man who keeps things on lists." Tobias looked out at the dark prairie. The night was full of insects, their sound continuous and somehow comforting, a reminder that the world was operational. "If he comes here," he said, "he'll find you've got neighbors." It was such a simple statement. So unadorned. Not a promise of heroics or a declaration of protection in the dramatic sense, just a plain acknowledgement of fact. And it undid her more completely than any dramatic declaration could have, because it was offered the way he offered everything, as something that was simply true, requiring no performance. She made herself look away from him before her face could tell him more than she was ready to say. The thing she was not ready to say was that she was falling in love with him. This was inconvenient and frightening, and complicated by approximately 50 different considerations, starting with the fact that she had been very specifically avoiding allowing herself to need people, and continuing through the consideration that Tobias had his own set of wounds that she was still learning the shape of, and arriving finally at the most pressing consideration, which was the one she thought about in the quiet of the mornings before dawn. She did not know his whole story yet, and the part she had not yet been told felt like it was significant. She knew about Dorothy. She knew about Tennessee in broad strokes. She knew he had come to Kansas with 2 small children and a red barn that needed painting, and that he had built something here through 5 years of grinding, relentless work. What she did not know was why he had left Tennessee. And she noticed, in the way that a person notices a gap in a map, that he navigated carefully around the question every time the geography of conversation came near it. She knew that kind of navigation. She had done it herself all spring. June turned to July, and Caldwell filled up with the sound of cattle drives coming north along the Kisham Trail, the lowing of longhorns and the shouting of drovers, and the general transformation of the town into something louder and more dangerous than it was during the quiet months. She went to town less during this period, not from fear exactly but from preference, the way you might close a window against noise that is not precisely threatening, but that interrupts concentration. Tobias came by one afternoon in the first week of July to tell her that he was going into Caldwell for supplies, and to ask if she needed anything brought back. She gave him a list, flour and salt and lamp oil and the particular thread she used for mending that she could not find anywhere else, and he took the list and read it with the same attention he gave to everything and then folded it and put it in his breast pocket. "Clara wanted to come with me," he said, "but I thought it was better she stayed home." "Is it bad in town?" "It'll be fine," he said, which was not quite an answer. "There was some trouble at the Long Branch last night. Nothing serious." "But I'd rather Clara not see it." She nodded. Then, because she had been cultivating a habit of directness with him, she said, "Is there something specific troubling you about this trip?" Looked at her, the honest, assessing look that she had come to recognize as his default when she asked him something that touched closer to the truth than expected. "I got a letter this morning," he said, From my brother in Tennessee. He's been asking me to come back." She waited. "I'm not going to," Tobias said, with a flatness that suggested this was not a new decision but an old one that the letter had required him to restate. "But the letter reminded me of something I have been meaning to tell you." He paused. She recognized the pause as the kind that comes before something difficult, and she steeled herself without knowing what for. "I came to Kansas because I had to," he said. "Not because I chose it purely for the farming. There was a situation in Tennessee, a legal situation." He said legal the way people say a word when they are aware of all the weight it carries. "My wife's family blamed me for Dorothy's death. They believed I had been negligent. There was a hearing, not a formal trial, but a hearing before a local judge. The judge found no wrongdoing on my part. But Dorothy's brother is a man with strong feelings and a long memory, and he made it clear that if I stayed in the county, my children would grow up in a household under constant siege. So I left." He said it plainly, the way he said everything, but she could hear under the plainness the bedrock of a deep wound, the particular pain of a man who has been blamed for something he did not do and had to choose between his name and his children's peace. "Dorothy's death," she said carefully. "What happened?" "Typhoid," he said. "The summer of 1880. It took 4 people in our county that summer. Dorothy was the third. I was with her every day until the end. Her brother believes I should have taken her to Memphis earlier, when the fever first started. He may be right about the timing, but the judgment of the hearing was that by the time the nature of the illness was clear, it was too late regardless." He looked at his hands, strong, calloused hands that she had watched fix fence posts and repair a loose hinge on her barn door without being asked. "I have asked myself every day since whether he's right," he said. "Whether I should have moved faster, whether I missed something. That," she said quietly, "is the question that grief asks you for the rest of your life. And the cruelty of it is that you cannot answer it because you cannot go back, and so it just keeps asking." He looked at her, and in his face she saw something she had not seen there before, or had seen it but not known what it was: recognition. The same recognition she had felt when Ezra had said that sometimes you want to be left alone, but what you actually want is for someone to come find you anyway. "Yes," he said simply, "exactly that." She wanted to reach across the distance between them and put her hand over his. She did not yet, because there was still a careful negotiation happening between them, an agreement about pace and trust, and the particular timing of people who have both been hurt in ways that make haste seem dangerous. But she felt the wanting of it with a completeness that she had not felt anything with in a very long time. He went to town and came back that evening with her supplies, and a small parcel that he left on her porch with a note in his deliberate, clean handwriting. The note said, "Saw this at Morrison's and thought you might use it." The parcel contained a bottle of decent ink and a new pen nib, which was exactly what she had been needing and had not thought to put on the list. She held the pen nib for a long moment and thought about the logistics and impossibilities of her situation, and then she sat down and wrote a letter to her father in Cincinnati for the first time in 6 weeks, and the letter was more hopeful than any she had written all spring, and she did not examine that fact too closely. July deepened and the heat settled over the prairie like a hand pressed flat, and Myrtle's garden began to actually produce things, tentatively at first, a few beans, some early squash, and then with more confidence, as if it had needed to test the situation before committing. She felt a kinship with the garden. Clara came by alone one morning while Tobias was in the far field, which was a significant development because Clara did not do things without purpose. She stood at the door with that contained, formal air she carried like a piece of luggage and said, "Ezra says you know mathematics." "I do," Myrtle said. "I need help with long division," Clara said, with an expression that made very clear this admission cost her something. Myrtle stepped back from the door. "Come in. I'll make tea." They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Clara was quick and precise and deeply frustrated by the specific mechanism of long division, not because she could not do it, but because she could not see why it worked, the logic underneath the process. and this frustrated her because she was a child who needed to understand the reason before she could accept the result. Myrtle recognized this instantly because she had been the same. She spent an hour not on the division itself, but on explaining the underlying principle, the relationship between multiplication and division, the way numbers are built, and she watched Clara's face change as the why became clear, watched the frustration become something else entirely, a kind of satisfied ignition. "Oh," Clara said. And then she did 6 problems in rapid succession, correctly, and looked up with an expression that Myrtle suspected was the closest thing Clara allowed herself to triumph. "You're very good at explaining things," Clara said, in a tone that made clear this was a meaningful compliment from someone who did not give them casually. "Very good at understanding things," Myrtle said, "which is rarer and more valuable." Clara looked at her for a long moment. Then she said with the directness that Myrtle was coming to recognize as a Wallace family trait, "You like my father." It was not a question. Myrtle considered denying it or deflecting or saying something safely vague. "Yes," she said instead. "I do." Clara nodded slowly. She looked down at her paper and straightened it unnecessarily. "Dorothy was my mother," she said. "I don't remember much about her. Ezra doesn't remember her at all. He was 3. "I know," Myrtle said quietly. "Papa doesn't talk about her much," Clara said. "I think it makes him sad." "I think being sad for a long time made him." She paused, searching for the word, quiet, in a way that wasn't always there before. "I think he used to be less quiet." Myrtle thought about the man she had been watching for the past 2 months, the careful deployment of words, the way he measured what he said and where he stepped. She thought that Clara was right, that there was probably a less careful version of Tobias Wallace that had existed before loss had taught him the cost of carelessness. "People change when they're sad for a long time," Myrtle said. "Sometimes they change into something harder and colder, but sometimes they change into something more careful and more kind. I think your father changed into the second kind." Clara considered this with all the seriousness she gave to long division. "I think so too," she said finally, and then she picked up her pencil and said, "Can we do more problems?" which was as much as she was willing to say on the subject, and Myrtle accepted the shift with grace. When Clara left that afternoon, she paused at the door and turned back, and for a moment she looked not 9 but much younger, the unguarded face underneath the contained one. "I don't mind," she said, "that you like him. I just wanted you to know." Myrtle kept her voice steady. "Thank you for telling me, Clara." Clara nodded, put her hat on, and walked home across the flat land with the straight-backed bearing of a girl who was working very hard at being sufficient. Myrtle stood in the doorway and felt her heart accommodate something new. The trouble with Hale Prescott arrived in August, which was, she thought later, the most Prescott-like timing possible, the middle of the hottest month, when everything was at its most strained. She came back from a trip to town for supplies to find her door was not latched the way she had latched it. It was closed, but the latch was slightly off in a way that was unmistakable to someone who latched a particular door the same way every day for over a year. She stood on her porch for a moment and understood what the improperly latched door meant, and felt a cold dread that was entirely separate from the August heat. She went inside carefully and found, after a thorough inspection, that nothing had been taken, but her writing desk had been gone through. The papers in the second drawer, her homestead documents, her financial records, a letter from her father's lawyer about the Prescott case, had been moved. Not dramatically ransacked, but shifted. Read and replaced by someone who was trying to be subtle and was almost but not quite thorough enough. Someone had been in her house, looking for something specific. She went to Tobias that evening. She walked the half-mile to his farm in the long evening light and found him on his porch with a cup of coffee, the children already in bed, and she told him what she had found. His face went very still as she talked. Not the stillness of disinterest, but the opposite, the stillness of attention pulled fully inward, assessing. When she finished, he said, "Does Prescott know anyone in Caldwell?" "I don't know," she said. "He might. He has business connections across 3 states. He's been in Kansas at some point, I believe. Cattle business. Land, always land with Prescott. Tobias nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment and she let him think. She had learned to trust his silences. "There's a man in town," he said finally, "named Reardon, James Reardon. He works as a land agent and sometimes as something less defined. He came to Kansas about 6 months ago from the east, and nobody I've talked to can quite account for his interest in Caldwell specifically." He paused. "He was asking about the farms east of town, including yours." She felt the pieces click together with a precision that was almost admirable in its architecture. Prescott had not come to Kansas himself. He had sent someone. A man with legitimate-looking business who could inquire and search and report back without attracting the kind of attention that a Cincinnati businessman would attract in a Kansas cattle town. "What is he looking for?" Tobias said. "I think," she said carefully, "that he is trying to establish whether I have a legal claim to the land, whether there is some argument that Gerald's investment partnership, which Prescott controlled, has a surviving interest in any assets I subsequently acquired." "Does he have an argument?" "No," she said. "The court in Cincinnati was explicit." But Prescott is the kind of man who believes that an argument does not need to be legally sound in order to be effective. He believes in pressure, in making the cost of resistance higher than the reward. Tobias stood up from his chair. He was a man who thought on his feet, she had noticed, who processed difficult information by moving, and he took 3 steps to the porch rail and stood there looking out at the dark. "He won't find what he's looking for," Tobias said, "because there's nothing to find." "Your claim is sound." "My claim is sound," she agreed, "but that has not historically stopped Prescott from being a problem." He turned to look at her. The evening light was behind him and she could not read his expression precisely, but his voice was clear. "I think you should talk to Sheriff Garrett," he said. "Tell him about the break-in, put it on record, and I think someone should have a conversation with Reardon." "What kind of conversation?" "The kind," Tobias said, "where a man makes it clear that the people around here know what he is and what he is doing, and that this particular county does not welcome that kind of operation." She looked at him. "I don't want you to put yourself in a position that creates problems for you." "Myrtle," he said, and the use of her name stopped her, the specific way he said it, as if it were something he kept carefully. "I am not in a position that can be made worse by helping someone I care about." Someone he cared about. The words landed softly and stayed. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in a way that went considerably past the surface of the statement. He spoke to Sheriff Garrett the next morning, and she went with him, because it was her claim and her house, and she was not a woman who let men handle her battles without her. Garrett was a practical man who took down the information about the break-in, and agreed that Reardon had been asking questions that fell outside the scope of ordinary land business. Tobias found Reardon at the hotel where the man was staying, in the lobby, and the conversation was observed by the hotel clerk and later reported to Myrtle as brief, direct, and entirely civil in a manner that suggested the civility was holding something larger behind it by a narrow margin. Tobias had told Reardon, apparently, that the homesteader east of town had legitimate title, had the full support of the community, and that any business interest in her claim that was not entirely above board would be met with the kind of collective attention that made speculative operations non-viable. Reardon left Caldwell 3 days later. She had a letter from her father's lawyer in Cincinnati 2 weeks after that, noting that Hale Prescott had withdrawn a preliminary inquiry he had made to a Kansas land records office. The inquiry had been filed under a technical precedent that was creative but ultimately without merit, and its withdrawal suggested that Prescott had decided the cost-benefit calculation of pursuing Myrtle Doyle across half a continent did not favor him. She read the letter standing in her kitchen on a bright August morning and felt something leave her. Something she had been carrying since she left Cincinnati, a specific weight that had become so familiar she had stopped noticing it until its absence made the air lighter. She folded the letter. Then she walked to Tobias's farm. He was at the fence line, not her fence line but his own, repairing a section that the summer had dried and loosened. He saw her coming and set down his tools and waited, reading her face from 30 yards out. "It's over," she said when she reached him. "He's withdrawn." He exhaled, slow and controlled. "Good. It's because of what you did," she said, "making it visible, making it a thing that had witnesses." "Reardon was the kind of man who relies on nobody looking," he said. "They always are." She was standing close to him now. The August sun was direct, and the air smelled of dried grass and the particular clean smell of worked wood from his tools. And she was looking at him, and he was looking at her, and the careful negotiation that had been happening between them all summer suddenly felt like it had reached some kind of completion. "Tobias," she said. "Yes," he said, and it was clear from the way he said it that he was answering something she had not spoken yet. She reached out and put her hand over his, the way she had wanted to do in July, and he turned his hand over under hers and held it, and they stood there in the August sun next to the fence he was repairing, holding on. "I am falling in love with you," she said, because she was finished with hesitation and she was finished with keeping things behind closed doors. "I know this is complicated. I know we both have histories that are difficult and that there are children to consider and 1,000 reasons to be careful, but I am falling in love with you and I thought you should know." He was quiet for one full beat. Then he said, "I am already there. I have been for some time. I was waiting for you to catch up." She looked at him, and he was not joking, but there was something in his face that was new, a looseness, a warmth, as if the careful whether he kept permanently in place had shifted. "You might have said something," she said. "You had enough to manage," he said, "and I thought you needed to arrive there on your own terms." She thought about this. She thought about the fence posts he had assessed without volunteering to fix, the list of supplies he had fulfilled plus the pen nib she had not thought to include, the conversation with Reardon that he had undertaken without making a production of his own role in it, the way he had listened to her talk about Gerald and Prescott and Cincinnati and the darkness of the spring she had spent alone and had offered nothing except his full, honest attention. "You are very patient," she said. "I am," he agreed. "But I'm done being patient." He kissed her there at the fence line, with August light all around them and the Kansas prairie going on forever in every direction. And it was not the tentative kiss of people who are uncertain, but the kiss of two people who have arrived, finally, at something they have been working toward through a long and complicated season. Ezra found out first because Ezra found out everything first due to an uncanny child's radar for developments in his immediate world. He appeared at Myrtle's kitchen table that same week and said, with the air of someone confirming a hypothesis, "You're going to be around more, aren't you?" "I expect so," she said. He nodded, satisfied. "Good. Can you make the cornbread with the honey in it again?" She made the cornbread. Clara was more complex in her response, as Clara was more complex in all her responses. But when Myrtle sat with her that Saturday and they worked through long multiplication together, and Clara demonstrated the satisfying, complete mastery of a mind that has properly understood something, and when Myrtle said quietly, "I am not trying to replace anyone," Clara looked up from her paper and said, "I know. You couldn't. But that's not what I need you to be." And then she went back to her multiplication, and the matter was settled. September came in cooler than August had threatened, and Ezra turned 7 with the gravity he brought to all things, and Myrtle made him a proper birthday cake using the last of her August sugar, and the 4 of them sat around Tobias's kitchen table and ate cake, and Ezra talked for 45 minutes about the life cycle of the monarch butterfly, which he had been studying with intense personal interest for reasons he considered self-evident, and Clara corrected 2 of his facts. And Tobias and Myrtle caught each other's eyes across the table, with an expression that contained the specific, overwhelmed tenderness of people who have found something they did not dare to hope for. After the children were in bed that night, Myrtle and Tobias sat on his porch, and he told her the rest of the Tennessee story, the parts he had held back, the specific texture of Dorothy's brother's campaign against him, the way a community can turn on a man who has been designated a target, even when the designation has no legitimate basis, the particular loneliness of being innocent and still convicted by the people around you. She listened with her full attention the way he had listened to her, and when he was done she said, "You moved 2 children across 3 states to give them a quiet life. That is not the act of a negligent man." He was quiet. Then, "I've needed someone to say that." "I know," she said. "That's why I said it." The first time she stayed for supper was in early October, which felt like a threshold being crossed, and it was, because Clara set her a place at the table without being asked, which was, from Clara, a declaration equivalent to a formal proclamation. They fell into a rhythm that was domestic and warm and careful, the way all good things are careful when they know their own value. She came to dinner twice a week. He came by her farm twice a week. On Sundays, all 4 of them went to services together, which produced some commentary from Mrs. Hartwell and some approving nods from Reverend Plunkett, and a general community understanding of the situation that Myrtle found she did not mind at all. November brought the first serious cold, and with it the recognition that the current arrangement of 2 farms and 4 people had a practical inefficiency that was becoming harder to ignore. Tobias raised it directly in his characteristically direct fashion on a Sunday afternoon in November when they were sitting by his fire while the children did their schoolwork at the table. "I have been thinking," he said, "about practicality." She waited. "One farm is more efficient than 2, he said. "One household is more efficient than 2. And he paused. "One family is more efficient than 2 households pretending not to be one family." She looked at him. He was watching the fire rather than her, which she recognized as the posture he adopted when he was saying something that mattered enough to make him careful. "Is that a proposal?" she said. "It is," he said. "An extremely practical one, but the practical case is not the actual reason." Now he looked at her. "The actual reason," he said, "is that you are the most honest person I have met since Dorothy died, and the most precise, and the most genuinely uninterested in anyone's opinion of you except your own, which is rarer than gold out here or anywhere else. And I love you, Myrtle, in a way that is not practical at all, and I want to spend the rest of my life on whatever farm we end up choosing with you." She held this. All of it. The practical case and the actual reason, offered together the way he offered everything, straightforwardly and without decoration, but with an honesty underneath it that was more valuable than decoration. "Yes," she said. He reached over and took her hand in the way he had been doing since August, and Ezra looked up from the table, assessed the situation, and went back to his spelling with the expression of someone whose hypothesis has been thoroughly confirmed. Clara looked up too. She and Myrtle regarded each other across the warm room. "Good," Clara said, with the weighted precision she gave to that word, and returned to her arithmetic. They were married on the 10th of December, 1883, at the Caldwell Methodist Church, with Reverend Plunkett officiating and Mrs. Hartwell weeping with an enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting for this event with great anticipation. Myrtle wore a dark blue dress she had sewn herself from fabric she had ordered from Kansas City, not white, because she was a woman who had been married before and who did not believe in performing fictions. The blue was the color of the Kansas sky on a clear morning, and she thought Gerald would have approved of it. Ezra served as ring-bearer with a solemnity that was slightly undermined by the fact that he spent the entire ceremony examining the stained glass windows with the scientific interest of a naturalist confronted with an unusual specimen. Clara stood beside Myrtle with perfect posture and held the small bouquet of dried flowers they had arranged together the previous day, and when Reverend Plunkett announced that Tobias might kiss his bride, Ezra said, distinctly, in the quiet of the church, "Finally," which produced a wave of laughter that Tobias only partly suppressed against Myrtle's hair. They moved Myrtle's things to Tobias's farm the following week. She brought her mother's quilt and her father's chemistry books and the 2 remaining chickens, who were integrated into the larger Wallace chicken situation with a diplomacy that required some negotiation. She sold her claim back to the land office because 4 people farming 160 acres was more than sufficient, and the money she received went into the fund Tobias kept for improvements, which now included painting the red barn, which Clara had apparently been waiting for someone to help organize for 2 years. They painted the barn in the spring of 1884, all 4 of them. Tobias and Myrtle on the upper sections with long-handled brushes, the children on the lower sections, which resulted in a paint job that was slightly uneven at child height, but which Clara defended as having character, and which Myrtle agreed had exactly that. Standing back to look at it, the red barn freshly painted under the wide Kansas sky, with Ezra explaining to his sister the aerodynamic properties of the paintbrush he had been using and Clara correcting his terminology. Tobias put his arm around Myrtle's shoulders and she leaned into him, and the feeling was so specifically right that she had to look at it carefully, the way you look at something you want to remember exactly. She wrote to her father in Cincinnati and described it. The barn, the children, the man beside her, the prairie that she had come to in grief and found, improbably, to be the place where she belonged. Her father wrote back with characteristic brevity and depth, saying only, "I hope the West would be generous to you. It appears to have exceeded expectations." He asked to come visit in the summer, and she wrote back immediately to say yes. Her father came in July of 1884, making the train journey to Wichita, and then continuing to Caldwell, arriving with 3 trunks and a quantity of books he felt she had been without too long, and the general air of a man who has been given excellent news and wants to see the evidence for himself. He met Tobias and shook his hand and spent 45 seconds looking at him in the precise pharmacist's way, measuring and assessing, and then said, "Good," and appeared satisfied. He was immediately adopted by Ezra, who discovered that Myrtle's father knew considerable amounts about chemistry, and who spent 4 days following him around asking questions that the older man answered with delighted thoroughness, apparently having found the audience he had been looking for his entire life. Clara and he conducted a lengthy conversation about mathematics that left both of them looking gratified, and he told Myrtle privately that her stepdaughter was remarkable. "She is," Myrtle agreed, and said it with a fullness that surprised even herself. Her father went back to Cincinnati at the end of the month with more color in his face than he had arrived with, and the promise to return the following year. He kept this promise, and the one after that. The fall of 1884 brought a good harvest, better than the 2 previous years, and Tobias added a proper parlor to the front of the house, which had been on the improvement list since before Myrtle had arrived. She furnished it with pieces she had ordered from a catalog, and one particular chair she had brought from her own house, a solid walnut piece that had been Gerald's, and that she kept because it was well made, and because she believed in honoring good things regardless of their complicated origins. Tobias asked her about the chair once. She told him directly where it had come from, and he looked at it and said, "Good chair," and that was the whole of it, and she loved him specifically for that response, for the undemonstrative generosity of it. There were moments of difficulty, as there are in any life built by imperfect people with histories. There were nights when Tobias went quiet in the way that Clara had described, the forgetting something look, when Dorothy's memory surfaced with full force, and he carried it alone because some grief is too old and too intimate to be shared even with someone you love. She learned to recognize those nights and to simply be present for them without requiring explanation, because she knew the arithmetic of loss and understood that it does not resolve. It only becomes something you carry differently. There were mornings when she woke to the flat Kansas light and felt, for a disorienting moment, that she was still in the spring of 1883, still keeping to herself, still managing the small economy of survival without the surplus of warmth. She learned to let those mornings be what they were without attaching significance to them, because grief is not linear and healing is not a progression to a fixed destination, but a landscape you learn to navigate. She taught Clara mathematics through the winter of 1884, and discovered in the process that Clara had an aptitude for it that went far beyond what their rural schooling had identified. She wrote to the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia about the possibility of women's education and received back materials that she and Clara read together with the intensity of people examining a map to a place they intend to go. "Someday," Clara said, turning the pages of the normal school catalog with careful hands. "Someday," Myrtle agreed, "and not as far as you think." Ezra continued to think too much, which Tobias continued to note with the exhausted affection of a parent who is, at base, extremely proud of this quality even as it depletes him. By the spring of 1885, he had developed strong opinions about crop rotation, butterfly migration, the structural properties of various fencing materials, and the acoustic characteristics of the barn at different temperatures, all of which he expressed with a comprehensive thoroughness that made Sunday dinners lively and extended. Myrtle loved him completely, this child who had knocked on her door when she had been keeping to herself all spring and asked her if she was lonely too. She loved him in a way that was not complicated by history or careful negotiation, just the clean, whole love that you have for someone who walked through your wall by accident, because they were simply too earnest and too brave to know they were not supposed to be able to. She told him this one afternoon in March of 1885, when he was 7.5 and sitting at the kitchen table drawing an extremely detailed diagram of the monarch butterfly's life cycle for a reason that was unclear. "Ezra," she said, he looked up. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know that." He looked at her with those grave brown eyes. "I know," he said. "I knew before you did." And then he went back to his diagram with the completeness of someone who has said the necessary thing and considers the matter settled. She told Clara the same thing at the table where they did mathematics, one evening in the spring when the light was long and golden and the farm was quiet. Clara looked at her over the workbook and said, "I know," in exactly the same tone Ezra used, and then she added with a softness that was rare for her, "I'm glad you answered the door." "So am I," Myrtle said. "So am I." The news came in the summer of 1885, confirmed by Doc Alderman in Caldwell in July, that Myrtle was expecting a child in the late winter or early spring. She told Tobias in the evening, on the porch where they had had so many of their most significant conversations, and she watched his face go through something that was too large for his usual careful containment, something that was not quite relief and not quite joy, but the combination of both with a gratitude underneath it that was old and deep. He pulled her close without saying anything for a long time, and she sat with her head against his shoulder in the evening air, listening to the Kansas night, thinking about the improbability and the perfection of the present moment. "Are you frightened?" he asked eventually. "Yes," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Terrified," he said. "But that's not the strongest thing I feel." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Clara, upon being told, produced a list of practical considerations about the arrangement of the house that was 8 items long and entirely correct in its recommendations. Ezra, upon being told, asked 3 questions about fetal development that she answered honestly to the best of her knowledge, and he appeared satisfied and said, "Good. I want a brother. I have opinions about the butterfly diagrams and I need someone to share them with eventually." "That is a very specific reason for wanting a sibling," Myrtle said. "I am a specific person," Ezra said reasonably. He was right. The child arrived in March of 1886, a boy they named James, after Myrtle's father whose middle name that was, and he was a robust, loud, thoroughly healthy child who made his opinions about the world known from the first hour with impressive volume. Clara held him with an expression that Myrtle recognized, because she had seen it on Tobias's face that evening on the porch when she had told him the news, something too large for containment. She held her baby brother with a care that was both gentle and absolutely ferocious, as if she were committing herself to his protection in the same moment. Ezra examined him with his naturalist's attention and then pronounced him acceptably formed, which Tobias received with a closed mouth and Myrtle received with a laugh that she did not try to suppress. James grew in the way that the farm had grown, steadily, and with increasing confidence once the initial conditions proved hospitable. He was a different temperament from both his siblings, less contemplative than Ezra, less precise than Clara, with a sociability that seemed to have come from some ancestral source that skipped a generation. A child who was happy in the world and made the world generally happy in return. Tobias, watching all four of them at the dinner table one evening in the fall of 1886, reached under the table and found Myrtle's hand and held it, the way he had been doing since August of 1883. She turned her hand over and held his back. The farm continued. The red barn stayed painted, a project they made annual, turning it into a late spring ritual that involved all available hands and a level of mess and joy proportionate to the number of people involved. Myrtle's garden, which had started with uncertain beans and tentative squash, expanded over the years into something substantial and productive. A kitchen garden and a small orchard planted in 1886 that would not produce fruit for several years, but that she planted with the specific confidence of a person who intends to be around for the harvest. She wrote to Hale Prescott exactly once, in the winter of 1885. She had debated this letter for months, had decided against it and then decided for it, and had written it with her good pen and the good ink that Tobias had brought her from Morrison's store on that first July trip to town, now more than 2 years prior. The letter said, "I am writing to inform you that I am well, that my claim is secure, that my family is established, and that the business between us is concluded by the Cincinnati Court's order of 1882, and by the withdrawal of your inquiry to the Kansas Land Records Office in 1883. I bear you no particular malice, but I want you to know that I am not a person who disappears, and that the cost of any future attention in my direction will be greater than any possible benefit. With regards, Myrtle Wallace." She had signed it Wallace rather than Doyle with a deliberateness that she was aware of and did not apologize for. She never heard from Prescott again. Clara enrolled at the Kansas State Normal School in Emporia in the fall of 1888. At 14, the youngest student in her cohort, which produced a considerable amount of commentary from the school administration and absolute zero change in Clara's intention to attend. She was the age she was, and she was as prepared as anyone they had enrolled that year, which they acknowledged when they saw her entrance examination results, and she was admitted with a scholarship that she had earned through the same combination of precision and thoroughness she brought to everything. Myrtle and Tobias drove her to the train in Caldwell on a September morning, all four of them together, and Clara said goodbye with her usual composed brevity. And then at the last moment, before she stepped onto the train, she turned back and hugged Myrtle with the complete, unguarded embrace of the girl underneath the contained one, the girl who had first come to ask for help with long division, and had found something she had not known she was looking for. "You are the reason I know I can do this," Clara said against her shoulder. "I need you to know that." Myrtle held on. "You are the reason I know I can do this," she said back. "So we are square." Clara pulled back, nodded once with absolute finality, and boarded the train. They watched the train leave Caldwell, and Tobias put his arm around Myrtle's shoulders, and Ezra, 12 years old and long past diagrams and now deep into a self-directed study of Kansas geology, said, with the exact tone his father used for necessary observations, "She'll be fine. She's Clara." "She is," Myrtle agreed. James, 3 years old, said, "Where did Clara go?" And when Tobias told him she went to school, James considered this and said, "When will she be back?" And when Tobias said, "Probably Christmas," James said, "Okay," and moved on with the equanimity of a child who trusts that things continue. They returned home, and the farm was quiet without Clara in it, differently proportioned, and they learned the shape of that new configuration the way you learn any change, by moving through it until it becomes familiar. She wrote Clara every week, long letters full of what was happening at the farm and in Caldwell, and in Ezra's current intellectual enthusiasms. And Clara wrote back shorter letters that were dense with observation and thought, the correspondence of a mind that was being productively challenged for the first time at a scale commensurate with its capacity. Ezra, in the spring of 1889, announced that he intended to study natural sciences, and specifically wanted to go to the State Agricultural College in Manhattan, Kansas, which had a program in natural history that he had researched with characteristic thoroughness. He was 13, so this was an intention rather than an imminent plan, but Tobias and Myrtle received it as what it was, a direction that was real, and they said so. And Ezra accepted their acknowledgement with the gravity he always gave to things that mattered. James began to develop the specific sociability of a child who is going to grow up to know everyone in a town, who stopped to talk to every person they met in Caldwell on supply runs, with an openness and warmth that left Myrtle slightly breathless, because it was so unguarded, so apparently immune to the self-protection that all the rest of them had needed to learn. "He's his own person," Tobias said one evening, watching James conduct a lengthy conversation with the feed store owner about the relative merits of different kinds of oats. "He didn't come from where we came from." "No," Myrtle said. "He came from after." Tobias looked at her. "He came from after we figured it out," she said. "He's made of what we became." Tobias was quiet for a moment, with the long quiet that he used for things that mattered too much for quick words. Then he said, "That is the best thing anyone has ever said to me." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the way she did on the porch in the evenings, and thought about all the ways a person can arrive at a life they did not expect, through grief and stubbornness and strategic withdrawal and impractical love. And a 6-year-old with a hat in his hands who knocked on a closed door and asked the right question. The Christmas of 1889 brought Clara home from Emporia for 3 weeks, full of ideas and opinions, and a new precision in her language that she had always had in embryonic form, but which had developed in the intervening year into something mature and formidable. She and Myrtle stayed up 2 nights running talking through ideas about women's education and the state of mathematical instruction in rural Kansas schools, and Clara's thesis work, which concerned statistical methods applied to agricultural yield data, a combination of interests that was so purely Clara that Myrtle felt a precise, complete joy in the existence of this specific person. Ezra and Clara argued cheerfully about the relationship between mathematics and natural science for most of Christmas week, and James watched these arguments with the absorbed attention of a child watching an exceptional performance. And Tobias sat beside Myrtle in the evenings, and they drank coffee, and did not say much, and did not need to. New Year's Eve of 1889, they were all 5 of them on the porch, even James in Tobias's arms wrapped in blankets against the cold, watching the Kansas sky, which was doing nothing particular, but was doing it on a vast scale, the way Kansas does everything. Myrtle stood beside Tobias and thought about the spring that now felt like something that had happened to someone she partially recognized, the woman who had kept every door closed, who had sat alone with her coffee watching the dawn and rehearsing the small economy of mere survival. She thought about the knock, small and certain as a sparrow's wing, the boy with the hat in his hands who had been brave enough to ask the question she had not been able to ask herself. She reached over in the cold dark and found Ezra's hand, standing beside her, 13 years old and looking at the sky with the focused attention he gave to everything. He looked at her sideways, and in the winter dark she could see his father's face in his, the same careful eyes, the same gravity. "Thank you," she said quietly, under the conversation Tobias and Clara were having about the next decade, the 1890s, what they might bring. Ezra considered this. "For what?" "For knocking," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the Wallace quiet that she now recognized across all of them as a family characteristic, the pause before something worth saying. "I was lonely too," he said simply. She squeezed his hand and he squeezed back, and Tobias put his arm around her, and James said something from inside his blankets that was probably about the oats, and Clara said something sharp and clear about the decade ahead, and the Kansas sky went on forever in every direction, the way it always had, the way it always would, indifferent and magnificent and entirely unconcerned with any of them. They were all five of them exactly where they were supposed to be. That was the extraordinary thing. After all of it, all the grief and the distance and the dark past, and the loneliness and the betrayal of a man named Prescott, and a legal system that had needed fighting and the terrifying vulnerability of beginning again, they were standing on a porch in Kansas in the cold of a December night, all five of them, holding on. The next year brought a second child, a girl they named Dorothy Rose, which Tobias had suggested, and which Myrtle had accepted immediately because it was the right thing to do, to bring forward the name of the woman who had been Clara and Ezra's mother, to carry it into the new decade without apology or diminishment, to honor what had existed before rather than pretending it had not. Dorothy Rose was born in October of 1890, red-faced and furious, and equipped with a set of lungs that she exercised without restraint from her first hour. James, 4 years old, was fascinated by her. Ezra pronounced her, after reflection, more substantial than anticipated, and she was. Clara came home for 2 weeks and held her baby sister, and the expression on her face was the one she had worn when she held James, the same fierce, bottomless commitment, and Myrtle watched this, and thought that Clara was going to be a remarkable woman, was already a remarkable young woman, and that the world was going to be better for it. Tobias held Dorothy Rose the first night while Myrtle slept, and she woke in the early hours to find him in the chair by the window with the baby in his arms, both of them quiet, his face in the lamplight turned toward the child with an expression that contained every hard year and every good one, and something that was simply love, wide and deep and undefended. She lay still and watched them and did not speak, because some moments are complete without addition. In the spring of 1892, Ezra left for the State Agricultural College in Manhattan, Kansas, at 16, which was younger than most students but not, the college found, younger than his preparation warranted. He packed methodically and spoke little about the leaving, which was so entirely him that it made the kitchen feel his absence acutely even before he left. The morning he departed, he stood at the door with his bag and his hat, which he wore properly now rather than turning it in his hands, and he shook his father's hand and then accepted his father's embrace, and then he turned to Myrtle. "You changed things," he said, with the directness that had been his native language since he was 6. "When you opened the door, everything changed when you opened the door." She took his face in her hands the way she had not done since he was small, and he let her, this 16-year-old boy who was going to study the natural world and understand it and offer that understanding back, and she said, "You changed things when you knocked. You were the brave one. You were always the brave one." He nodded, accepting this as a fact. He put on his hat. He walked to the wagon and they drove him to the train and watched him go. And James, 6 years old and standing at the platform, said earnestly, "He's going to come back a lot." And Tobias said, "Yes, he is." And Dorothy Rose, in Myrtle's arms, said nothing because she was 2 and was concentrating on a button she had found on Myrtle's coat. They drove home through the spring Kansas morning, the prairie on all sides, the sky overhead in that particular blue that she had named a dress after once, a long time ago, when she was marrying a man on a cold December day and wanted to wear the color of the world she had found here. She was 40 years old in 1898. She did not mind 40. 40 felt like a country she had been working toward for a long time and had earned the right to inhabit without apology. The century ended. The new one came. The farm was a good farm by any measure, productive and well-maintained, with an orchard that had grown from saplings she had planted in 1886 into trees that gave excellent yield in September. The red barn stayed red. Clara was teaching mathematics at a school in Emporia and was engaged to a man named Henry Marsh, who had the good sense to be somewhat afraid of her, which Myrtle and Tobias agreed was the correct response and suggested well for his character. Ezra was at the United States Department of Agriculture by 1900, working in the Division of Entomology, which was either entirely surprising or completely inevitable, depending on how well you had known him at 6. He wrote long, detailed letters about monarch butterfly migration patterns that Myrtle read with complete attention and filed carefully. James worked the farm with Tobias and had, as predicted, become someone who knew everyone in Caldwell and was known by everyone in return. A young man of 19 with his father's build and his own easy warmth, and a talent for making things grow that was, Tobias said, almost immodest. Dorothy Rose, at 10, was reading at a level that alarmed her schoolteacher and delighted her mother, who provided her with books from every available source and taught her the mathematics Clara had taught Myrtle how to teach, and sat with her in the evenings working through problems that grew steadily harder and more satisfying. On a spring evening in 1901, Myrtle and Tobias sat on the porch as they had been sitting on porches together for 18 years. The apple trees were flowering. James was somewhere in the far field. Dorothy Rose was inside reading by the lamp. The sun was going down in the extravagant Kansas fashion, using every color it had available, and they sat with their coffee and watched it the way they had learned to watch it together, with the comfortable attention of people who have looked at the same thing many times and find it still worth looking at. "Are you happy?" Tobias asked. He asked this occasionally, not as a challenge or an audit but as a genuine inquiry, because he was a man who believed in direct questions. "Yes," she said, without qualification. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, a silence that needed nothing added to it. Then she said, "I have been thinking about something. Tell me." "Ezra asked me when he was 6 if I was lonely too," she said, "and I did not actually answer him. I changed the subject by inviting him in for coffee." Tobias looked at her. "The answer," she said, "was yes. At the time I was very lonely, and frightened and grieving and stubborn and wrong about most of the things I thought would keep me safe." "Yes," he said. "The answer now," she said, "is that I do not know what loneliness feels like anymore. I have genuinely forgotten the texture of it. It has been replaced by something so entirely different that I cannot locate the original feeling anywhere." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had been doing for 18 years, and she held it, the way she had been doing for 18 years. "I was lonely too," he said. "Before, I know you know that, but I want to say it out loud. I was very lonely and I did not know how to say so, and then my son went and said it for me, which is," he paused, "entirely typical of Ezra." She laughed. The full laugh, the one that had come back to her in the summer of 1883 and had not left since. "It is entirely typical of Ezra," she agreed. Dorothy Rose came to the door and looked out at them. "It's getting dark," she said, which was technically true and also entirely irrelevant since neither of them was likely to move. "It is," Myrtle agreed. "What are you reading?" Dorothy Rose described at length the novel she was currently engaged with, a story about the sea, which neither she nor any member of the family had ever seen, but which she was now quite certain she intended to see someday. And Myrtle listened and asked questions, and Tobias listened with the patient attention of a father who finds his daughter's enthusiasms genuinely interesting. And the Kansas evening deepened around them, the stars coming up one by one in the enormous sky. The apple trees settling into the dusk with the stillness of things that are exactly where they are meant to be. Eventually, Dorothy Rose went back inside. The night settled. They stayed on the porch a while longer, as they usually did, in no hurry, with no particular reason to be anywhere else. The prairie went on around them in the dark, the same prairie that had seemed to her once like an absence, a subtraction of everything familiar. She knew it differently now. It was not an absence. It was a presence that did not announce itself, that required you to stay long enough and be quiet enough and open enough to learn its language. She had learned it. Through a spring of keeping to herself and a summer of careful beginning, and a fall of growing certainty, and a winter of arrival. Through years of harvests and fence repairs and birthday cakes and long division and painted barns and train platforms and letters, and the accumulated ordinary weight of days lived alongside someone who loved her without requiring her to be anything other than exactly what she was. The knock had started it. A small hand on a pine door. A child brave enough to ask the question out loud. She had opened the door. Everything had come through it. Tobias shifted beside her, the familiar weight and warmth of him after all these years, and she leaned into his shoulder, and the Kansas stars continued their indifferent and magnificent performance overhead, and the apple trees bloomed in the dark, and the farm was quiet and full and whole, and so was she.